it's possible to modify aging biology and even reverse some of the functional declines that go along with aging. One of the big, I think, first indications of this were studies of rapamycin. Everywhere we've looked in the laboratory, we can give these animals rapamycin, they live longer, and they seem to be healthier, and it seems to be broadly slowing the biological aging process.
Today's guest is no different. Someone who's not just studying aging, he's redefining how we think about it. We're joined by Dr. Matt Kaeberlein, a globally recognized leader in aging research, longevity science, and health span innovation, a true biogerontologist. And he also has an amazing research in rapamycin that I've been following. And for those of you who are interested in anti-aging longevity, this is going to be exciting for you. He's the co-director of the University of Washington Nathan Schock Center of Excellence in the Basic Biology of Aging, the director of SageWeb, and the founding director of Healthy Aging and Longevity Research Institute at the University of Washington, where he's been there for the last 20 years. From groundbreaking research to the Dog Aging Project and the future of personalized longevity treatments, this is definitely one episode that you don't want to miss. Welcome, Dr. Kaeberlein.
Thanks, guys. Pleasure to be here.
Let's dive straight into the biology of aging. What's the first real sign that someone's aging, and what can you do about it?
Yeah, so I think the first signs that we notice are obviously going to be different for different people. There are things that happen sort of under the surface that we may not even appreciate. So for example, in our early 20s, our thymus will decline in function, and that's where we get a lot of the immune cells that help our bodies to fight off infections and our immune system to function well. Most people don't even know that.
Sure.
But then as we get older, I think most people start to experience gray hair, aches and pains. In women, ovarian failure, perimenopause leading to menopause. Men have some similar changes in reproductive function. And then, of course, there's the later effects, increased risk of disease. I think it's worth just stating explicitly, that if you look at the top 10 causes of death in the United States, 9 of them have aging biology as their greatest risk factor, right? So, from a societal perspective, medical perspective, it really is the biology of aging that is driving most of the functional declines and diseases that affect most people in developed countries.
How has our understanding of aging shifted over the past decade? And what's kind of surprised you the most?
I would say, I don't know about the last decade, science moves slowly for sure. Certainly, I've been in this field for 25 years, a little bit more than that. I started in graduate school, actually, in the late 1990s. And I would say that there are a couple major things that have changed over that time period that have been really important. I think one is simply this understanding that we're starting to figure out, what are the mechanisms of biological aging at the cellular, molecular, biochemical. We can now point to these hallmarks of aging. There are 12 of them. That's a piece of the puzzle, but these are very specific things that are driving the biological aging process. One of the other things I think that is really important is that aging seems to be much more, I guess I would say, plastic than the way we thought about it when I started in this field. When I started in this field, we thought of biological aging as just this, inevitable accumulation of damage, and that damage accumulation increases exponentially as a function of time or chronological age. I think what we've learned is that it's possible to modify aging biology and even reverse some of the functional declines that go along with aging. One of the big, I think, first indications of this were studies of rapamycin, which I know we're going to talk about more, where it was found that you could actually start the treatment in middle age, get significant increases in lifespan, this is in mice, and also reverse functional changes in heart and ovary and brain and oral cavity and the immune system, actually see improvements in function. So it seems as though aging is much more malleable than I think we had appreciated when I first started in the field. And as we look to take some of what we've learned in the laboratory and apply it in humans, that malleability is really important because it gives us opportunities to actually detect improvements in the trajectory of aging in humans and actually improve quality of life for people. And at this point, I would say it's not clear that there's a point where it's too late. I think at the individual level, sometimes once an age-related disease, the pathology of that disease has progressed to the point where it's no longer being driven by the biological aging process, then it might be too late. But up until that point, it seems as though there are significant impacts that we can have on aging biology to improve health span and potentially lifespan.
We definitely agree with you. The idea that, we talk about these biohackers, and it shows us that there is definite potential. Going back to rapamycin. So, just an amazing drug or compound, we'll say, where rapamycin, I believe, and you could tell us even further, I think it was found in the Easter Islands. It was a bacteria that we used for immunosuppression. And I know that Dr. Danielpour, when we were in transplant surgery, we saw a lot of sirolimus, which is the other name of it. And, sirolimus and tacrolimus, these were immunosuppressants that everyone who underwent a transplant were placed on these medicines. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the pathway. And from my understanding, we'll just put it simply, I think it really helps slow down cellular aging. Maybe you can give your thoughts on it, because honestly, you're one of the foremost experts in rapamycin, and it's such a buzzword in the quote unquote biohacking community. Maybe you can clarify some things and say, all right, is it good for us? Is it not? Should you be using it? Should you avoid it?
Yeah, I mean, lots obviously to unpack there with rapamycin. So you're right. I mean, it's a molecule. It is a drug, but it's also a natural product in the sense that it's produced by a naturally occurring bacteria that was found on Easter Island or Rapa Nui. That's where the drug gets its name from. And as you alluded to, in the clinical literature, it goes by the name sirolimus. It's identical molecule. So rapamycin and sirolimus are the same thing. So let me just start with what we know, right? So what we know is that rapamycin is an inhibitor of a protein called mTOR. mTOR stands for mechanistic target of rapamycin. So they named the protein after the drug. It's an inhibitor, meaning it turns down mTOR activity. And mTOR is kind of a central gatekeeper that senses the environment, particularly nutrients or food availability in the environment, and helps the cell make the appropriate decision based on the environment. Is it a good time to grow and reproduce? A good time to do that is when there's lots of food. So when there's lots of food, mTOR gets turned up. That signals growth and reproduction. When there's not very much food, mTOR gets turned down, and that signals shutting down growth and reproduction and becoming stress resistant. So rapamycin in some ways tricks the cell or the organism into quote unquote thinking there isn't very much food around, even when there's lots of food around. It's a drug that turns down this mTOR knob. So it's a sort of like a calorie restriction mimetic is what some people would call it. It doesn't do everything that caloric restriction does. It's very specific though. It turns down mTOR. Okay. So the other piece of information that's relevant here is many different labs, more than probably 20 over the last 20 years, have found that if you take different animals and you give them rapamycin, or you genetically turn down mTOR, you can do that a variety of ways, that slows aging. So it increases lifespan across the board. And it seems to delay, or in some cases even reverse, the functional declines that go along with aging and the cellular and molecular processes that go along with aging. It hits all of the hallmarks of aging. And this has been seen, like I said, in every animal where it's been tested, spanning billions of years of evolution. So it seems to be kind of a fundamental gatekeeper for the biological aging process. And that's probably related to its role that I mentioned as a nutrient sensor that controls growth and reproduction versus stress resistance. Lots of growth, lots of reproduction is typically associated with faster aging. Slower growth, turning down reproductive signals, higher stress resistance is typically associated with slower aging. So those things are probably coupled. But the take home is everywhere we've looked in the laboratory, we can give these animals rapamycin, they live longer, and they seem to be healthier. And it seems to be broadly slowing the biological aging process. And, we understand to some extent at the cellular molecular level how that's working, but it's an incomplete picture. It's definitely through mTOR, the protein that rapamycin inhibits, but there's lots of things that mTOR does, like regulating autophagy. I'm sure some of your listeners have heard of autophagy, like improving or regulating mitochondrial function. Inflammation is a key downstream process that's regulated by mTOR. So there are probably multiple things that rapamycin is doing to have this impact, at the cellular molecular level. And we're still working that out.
And does that translate when you talk about, you're talking about all these animal studies? I know that Look, there's a lot of humans taking it right now. How does that translate to human biology, and is it doing the same thing? Because I think in the mouse model, it added a 30% increase in longevity. That's significant for a human. So are we expecting the same thing?
Yeah. Well, the honest answer is we don't know yet. So 30% is the upper limit. So people have tested a few different doses, a few different strategies, and that's about the best we've been able to do with rapamycin in mice.
Okay.
We are actually, as part of the dog aging project, testing rapamycin in companion dogs in a randomized clinical trial. We don't know the answer yet, but I think that will be informative. And then, as you alluded to, there are many, I don't know what the exact number is, but I'm guessing it's in the tens of thousands now, people worldwide using rapamycin off-label in the hopes that it will improve health span and or lifespan. Unfortunately, that's all, N of one experiments. And so we don't know the answer yet. We've collected data from a few hundred people using rapamycin off-label. And I think what I can say with, some level of confidence is that the side effect profile is very low. It could be a self-selected group, but in that group, and we compared it to people who'd never used rapamycin, only one side effect was statistically more prevalent in the rapamycin users. That was mouth sores, also seen in organ transplant patients. About 15% of people using rapamycin off-label get mouth sores. There were 6 other things that were different statistically, but they were all lower in the rapamycin users. That included things like chronic pain, depression, anxiety. So whether that's real or not, I don't want to, I don't want to draw too many conclusions from this because it's an imperfect data set.
Sure.
Interesting. I think what we can say with some level of confidence is people who have a high degree of sterile inflammation, they typically tend to be the ones who feel better when they start taking rapamycin. Again, that's very plausible given the mechanism of action of rapamycin. And there are hints that for sort of chronic viral conditions like long COVID, some people may experience some symptom relief. But all of that is anecdotal, and I wish we had better data.
Right.
I'm particularly intrigued by the effects of rapamycin on the brain. There have been a couple of studies that just came out suggesting improvements in hippocampal and caudate nucleus volume, cerebral blood flow, particularly in ApoE3, E4 carriers. So intriguing early data, but we just don't know, with a lot of confidence how broadly applicable rapamycin is going to be to improve health span in people. And then lifespan you asked about, and this is pure speculation. My intuition is we probably can't go on a percentage basis from mice to people because people live so much longer than mice. So I'd be surprised if we could get a 30% increase in lifespan, pleasantly surprised, but I wouldn't anticipate that being the case going from mice to people. I think it's probably going to be, a more modest effect on lifespan, if there's any effect on lifespan. I'm pretty bullish that rapamycin can improve health span, again, at least for people who have a high amount of sterile inflammation.
Which is probably most of us. And, if you think about the 4 lead killers, we call them the 4 horsemen, it's all that type of inflammation when you talk about cancer and cardiovascular disease and neurodegenerative changes and metabolic syndrome. I would imagine that a lot of people will be affected. Who knows? Maybe rapamycin will be the next Ozempic craze. Everybody's waiting for that one paper to come out that's going to say, here you go. You're going to live to 120, no problem.
Yeah, I wouldn't hold your breath for that paper, unfortunately. This is actually worth mentioning. It's been very difficult to get the clinical trials going with rapamycin because it's off patent, right? There's no financial incentive for people to do the clinical trials. So we're sort of left in this middle ground where we're trying to get the data that we can, but we just don't have those clinical trials that would definitively give us confidence or not about rapamycin for different endpoints. There are a few. There's one for periodontal disease right now. There's one for early ovarian failure. They're pretty small, but I think we'll be able to get some indications from those clinical trials about at least specific endpoints with rapamycin.
Yeah, you talked about the dog aging project, which is really interesting. And, it's a great segue into human trials, right? Because, we look at, I have a dog and I look at it, of course, we want them to live longer and longer. Tell us about the dog aging project.
Sure. Yeah. So the dog aging project really has 2 components to it. And there's really 2 overarching goals. One is to understand the most important genetic and environmental factors that influence health outcomes during aging in companion dogs. And I should say the Dog Aging Project is all companion dogs living with their owners, so all pet dogs. We're not doing anything with captive dogs in the laboratory. So one is to understand aging and what are the most important factors that influence aging in dogs. And the other I sort of characterize as do something about it. So can we find a way, an intervention that can slow aging, increase lifespan, improve health span in people's companion animals? And so let's start with the second piece, because that's a little bit easier to break down. That's the rapamycin clinical trial. So right now there's one clinical trial. It is of rapamycin, and the goal there is really to determine, does rapamycin increase lifespan in dogs? And lifespan is the primary endpoint. There are several secondary endpoints that are different health span metrics: activity, neurological function, things like that, heart function. But lifespan is the primary endpoint, and that's what the trial is statistically powered for. And as I mentioned, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled. There's nothing unique about rapamycin, and I think this model can and should be applied to other interventions because we don't know if rapamycin is going to work, and there are other things that we know slow aging in laboratory animals, and I would really like to find one or more things that slow aging in dogs. I think that would be immensely valuable. So I think this is part testing rapamycin, it's part creating the template that others can use to do these kinds of clinical trials. And it's probably obvious, but worth saying, why dogs? Well, dogs age 7 to 10 times faster than people do. So in the case of the clinical trial, we can actually get the answer in 3 years. It would take us 20 plus years in humans and hundreds of millions of dollars, right, to do a lifespan study.
Are you seeing some parallels between human and dogs? I mean, you had alluded to that earlier, that we're, with all species, we're kind of seeing the same thing.
Right. So then the other part is the longitudinal study. And that's where I think I can state with high degree of confidence that aging is very highly conserved, shared between dogs and humans. So the longitudinal study is the observational part, just following dogs, identifying factors that influence health during aging. We're not asking the owners to do anything different. We're just collecting data and biological samples from those dogs. There are 50,000 plus dogs in the longitudinal study right now. And one of the things we've learned is that, and this isn't shocking, that dogs age very much like people do at the functional level. They get the same functional declines, the same diseases that people do. The diseases are age associated in dogs, just like they are at people. And also at the molecular level, dogs age very much like people do. So to give an example, I'm sure, again, many of your viewers will have heard of these epigenetic clocks, right? These aging clocks where you can take blood, measure the epigenetic profile, and see these changes with age. Turns out you can actually do that in dogs as well. And there are certain algorithms where you can use the same epigenetic marks between dogs and humans. And what's interesting is you see the acceleration of epigenetic aging in dogs that looks very much like the acceleration of other phenotypes of aging, functional declines and disease onset. It's actually quite interesting. Dogs seem to age maybe 15 to 20 times faster than people do early in life. And then that accelerated rate of aging slows down in a relative sense to maybe 2 or 3 times the rate of aging that people do later in life. And you can actually map that through these epigenetic clocks.
That's amazing. When we're talking about humans, you had mentioned in some of your past research, I just read the new article, congratulations, in American Scientific. And when we look at the role of personalized medicine, what role do you think that will really take in longevity strategies?
Yeah, great question. So that's my day job now. So I'm actually currently the CEO of a company called OptiSpan, which is really about trying to create the technologies to enable real science-based, evidence-based proactive approaches in healthcare. And I think it has to be the future. I mean, for a variety of reasons. One, we can do it, and it's the most effective way to improve health for people. But another being that I think our current reactive disease care system is not sustainable. And we could get into all the statistics supporting that. For now, I'm just going to say it's not sustainable. We can't continue on the path that we're on. I think one of the things we've seen is in the United States, there's been an expansion of what I call sick span, right? This period of life where people spend, decades with one or more chronic diseases of aging. And that's driven by a whole bunch of environmental factors, but it's bankrupting our system. So we really do need to move towards a more proactive approach. I think longevity science plays an important role there, but it's not the only thing that's going to enable this shift. I think advances in diagnostics and better understanding about which diagnostics are informative, which aren't, better education of medical professionals as well as consumers will play an important role here. And then advances in the science of longevity, I think, will enable even better health outcomes for people. Right now, to be honest with you, lifestyle changes is where most of the action is at. And
Sure.
I think it's worth saying the reason why lifestyle has such a big impact on health span is precisely because lifestyle impacts the biology of aging. What you eat, how much you exercise, whether you get good sleep, if you have good human relationships, those all impact the biology of aging. That's why they impact all of the age-related diseases simultaneously, not just one at a time.
By the way, I'm going to chirp in here for a sec. OptiSpan looks fantastic. This is our healthcare system should be run. I mean, it really is a comprehensive approach. I mean, I know a lot of different people have tried this, but do you mind talking about that for a minute? This is a great way to, instead of going into the traditional healthcare system.
Happy to talk about it. Again, I would frame us as first and foremost a healthcare technology company, meaning our goal is really to develop the tools that enable this type of healthcare, proactive, science-based, preventative, personalized healthcare. But in order to do that, we felt like we needed to have our own clinical program so we could figure out what works, what doesn't work, where are the friction points, what do we need to build into the platform. So right now we have a couple of clinical programs. One is out-of-pocket sort of concierge medicine approach. The other is a corporate healthcare program. So we're running the corporate healthcare for a company called Sabi Corporation. Again, really trying to figure out what works, what doesn't work, where's the 80-20 in terms of, you could spend insane amounts of money measuring everything you could possibly measure, what's informative. And so it's been a learning experience for me. It's been fantastic for me because I get to learn a lot about my own health. And believe me, I have, coming out of academia. But I agree with you completely. Like, this is the model. And I'm excited to see that there are, small but growing number of organizations, people in this space who are really trying to do this in a rigorous, serious way and understand. And I mean, I'm sure you guys appreciate this. There's a lot of gray area out there, right? There's a lot of things where, we don't know for sure. Rapamycin is a good example. We know it works in laboratory animals. We don't know for sure it's going to work the same way in people. There are some risks associated with all of the different interventions that you could use, and really trying to figure out how do we navigate that gray area. That, to me, I see as one of the most interesting and important challenges that the sort of longevity community faces right now is how do we live in the gray area? So I think we can reach consensus on what's solid. I think we can, well, I don't know if we can reach consensus on what's snake oil, but I have my own opinions. But then within the gray area, how do we navigate that? And how do we get, like-minded, scientifically minded people to help us navigate the gray area? Because I feel like right now it's a lot of N of one, anecdotal stuff.
Right.
One doc tells another doc, oh, I tried this and, this was the outcome. And suddenly everybody thinks it works. I'm not super comfortable with that model. So I'll just be honest, I'm trying to figure it out too, but I think that's where we have to really start to spend some time and figure out, can we aggregate data across clinics? Can we do it in a way that's going to ensure patient privacy, but also allow some consensus to be reached? How do we get that network put together? I think those are all important questions that anybody who wants to be in this space and also take a scientific approach should be thinking about.
Well, going along those lines, where do you think the biggest misconceptions about longevity and anti-aging in that type of science, what do you encounter? Where is it the fact that people are saying, all right, they are using that N of one and saying, hey, well, it worked over here, so we're going to start implementing it? Because this is what I see, look, we already know when it comes to regenerative medicine, we're beyond the safety aspect. It's the efficacy that we're looking for. There are too many gaps, right? So we've got trials of stem cells that have improved cardiac tissue. Have trials that have improved organ, tissue regeneration, things like this. What are the common misconceptions that you encounter?
There are a bunch. I think, certainly supplements are a really tricky area. There's a misconception that supplements are safe, right? That if it can be bought on Amazon, it's perfectly safe.
Right.
That's not true.
Yeah, definitely.
Not only because FDA hasn't validated safety, these things are quote unquote generally recognized as safe until they're not, right? But also because of the manufacturing process and impurities that get in there. And if you're taking a stack of 50 supplements, like you have no idea what that's doing to your body.
Very true.
Also, there's a misconception that if it worked in one animal study, suddenly we should start using it in people. You see a lot of biohackers go down this road that, there's one worm study. And look, I'm a worm guy. I worked in C. elegans. I get it. But that is not proof that you should start taking this thing just because there was one kind of weak C. elegans study that showed a lifespan extension. I think there's a misperception that I don't know if it's a misperception about the scientific literature. I think most people recognize there's a reproducibility challenge in science in general. But again, this is related to looking at one study and then extrapolating from that. They don't recognize how much noise there is in the scientific literature, I guess I would say. And there's a lot of cherry picking of data. So a lot of the influencers out there will take one study that fits their preconceived notion, pop that study up, and then not mention the 15 others that go the other direction, right? So I just think there's a lot of noise in general. The other misperception I'll just briefly mention, because it's sort of a pet peeve of mine right now, is around the quote unquote biological aging clocks. And there's a couple things I would say there. One, super powerful research tools, right? I think this is the future for biomarkers in the space. So I don't mean to demean or diminish the idea that we can use biomarkers to estimate mortality risk or disease risk. We're getting closer to being able to do that in a very, very powerful way. And I'm very optimistic about that.
You mean measuring, where we used to measure telomere length or DNA methylation or things like that? Or do you mean actual, HSCRP or?
Yeah, I would put them all as biomarkers. I think the question is which biomarkers are going to be most informative, which are going to be most precise, which are going to be most accurate. But yes, all of those. I think right now there's a lot of excitement around DNA methylation. And that's the one that's been rushed, I think, into the consumer space. All of these companies selling these epigenetic or DNA methylation tests, which they call, quote unquote, biological aging tests. So that's one of the misconceptions that I think people don't understand is none of those things are measuring biological aging. They're measuring a correlation to biological aging. So the way these things have been developed is they look at patterns of DNA methylation or other biomarkers that are correlated to something like mortality risk, 3-year, 5-year, 10-year. And of course, mortality risk is correlated to biological age, but it's not biological age. And sometimes they're correlated to disease risk, but that's not biological age. None of these things are measuring biological age. I think that's just important for people to understand. And the other is in the direct-to-consumer space, there's no transparency around precision. That you can't measure accuracy because they aren't measuring biological age.
Right.
You can measure precision. I've done it. It's terrible. But there's no transparency around the precision. What I mean by that is if you take the same test, 3 times on the same sample, or you test 4 different companies or 5 different companies on the same sample, it's all over the place. And I think that gets lost. And these things are just presented to people as if they're actually measuring biological age. They're not, and they're not very accurate right now. And I think that's a problem in the space. And I think it's creating a reputational problem for the space as people are learning that there's just a lot of noise in these tests.
I think I know the answer to this, but do you think that AI is going to help us? I mean, tabulate data, put it together, look at patterns and say, okay, we see something that's going to stick.
I absolutely do. And again, I think, that'll happen first on the research side. So I want to be careful to differentiate between what's happening in the research world, in the academic world, and what's happening in the direct-to-consumer world. And I know I bash the direct-to-consumer companies a little bit, but I think the incentives are just completely misaligned in the direct-to-consumer space because the incentives are about revenue, not about validation and showing, what these things are actually measuring. On the research side, it's already happening. Like we're already seeing, big impacts from AI, especially in the context of very large data sets, these large open access UK Biobank, all of us, things like that, these very large human data sets. That's where I think we're going to see the first sort of obvious application of AI for novel biomarker discovery, things like that. The other piece, though, that I think is underappreciated is when it comes to kind of understanding fundamentally the biology of aging, and especially which interventions are likely to work and can we find new interventions. I don't think AI is going to be able to live up to its potential until we have a lot more data. So in that space, our data set is very constrained. And, AI is only as good as the data you can train the model on. And right now, I don't think we have enough data to really optimally get value from these very, very powerful AI tools that are coming online. I think one of the places I'm excited about for AI is in the medical space, and I'm sure you guys have thought about this as well. How can these AI tools be used to get to sort of personalized intervention plans, AI agents that docs or patients can interact with? That's going to happen. People are already starting to do it, but it's only going to get better. And I think, 2-3 years from now, we're going to have pretty sophisticated AI health span agents that a lot of us carry around in our pockets, especially if we can figure out how to navigate the data privacy piece so that, these tools can be informed by everybody's or your own complete comprehensive data set, right, for the different diagnostics that you can get access to. And I'll just finish up by saying, it may sound naive. I don't think it is. I really see opportunities for democratization of healthcare through these AI tools, that a lot of this will become available to anybody who wants access to it, who knows how to use these tools. And I hope that will help a lot more people be able to take a more proactive approach to their healthcare.
I'm going to ask it's a very base question. And in your opinion, after 25, 26 years of research in the longevity and anti-aging space, are we going to live to 150? And then explain why it's not that simple to...
Yeah, I don't know the answer. I don't know that I want to know the answer, actually. I was going to say, I don't know if I do. So let me tell you, I'm of two minds on this. I think there's no doubt that technology is advancing, especially in the AI space, at an exponential rate. That's happening. And it's hard to predict what the outcomes from that will be. What I can say is when you look at the basic research space in longevity, and if you use lifespan as the metric, and that's what we're talking about, 150 years, 200 years, if you use that as the metric, we have not been successful at obtaining larger and larger effects on lifespan, even in very simple animals like mice in the laboratory. In fact, the largest increase in lifespan from an intervention, let's just say a non-genetic intervention, is a study that was done in the 1980s, 1990s by Rick Weindruck and Roy Walford using 65% caloric restriction, gave about a 60% increase in lifespan. Nobody's done better than that since the early 1990s, okay?
Wow.
So, it's hard for me to credit the idea that we're going to achieve extreme life extension when we haven't even met the bar that was set, 30 plus years ago. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but there are reasons for this. And again, I'm not a pessimist at all. I think we can do huge things for health span. I think there are reasons why we haven't done better than that. I think one is a lack of discovery science, meaning because the hallmarks of aging became formalized, that kind of shifted everybody to looking under the lamppost instead of looking at what we didn't know. I think that's had an impact. And then I think there's it's a hypothesis, but there's some reason to believe that there may be this barrier that we don't understand biologically at about 120 years in people, or at about, 4 years in mice. And we haven't been studying that biology. We've been studying the biology of aging that lets us get up to that barrier.
Right.
I think it's reasonable that most people can get to 110 or over 100 in relatively good health. Can science get us there? Yeah, I think we can get there given the approaches we're taking today. I'm not saying it's going to happen, in 3 years.
Sure.
I think given what we know today and the approaches that we're taking, that's a pretty reasonable extrapolation. We can get a lot more people closer to that 120-year barrier.
You think at that point there's going to be a limit? So, again, if I'm going with what you're saying, the health span, which is how well we live during those years, improves, that will still reach that limit, as far as from a timeline perspective, and then the body will just shut down.
Yeah, well, I guess the way I would frame it is not an unbreakable limit. I just think it's different biology than what we've been studying so far. That doesn't mean we can't
Interesting.
understand it, get past it. But I feel like the hallmark paradigm, again, is really seems to be focusing on those mechanisms that can get us out to that point. And it's interesting. I went to this, they called it a gerophysics conference. So it's a combination of geroscience, biology of aging, and physics, right? And that was one of the themes that came out of the meeting is when you model mathematically using principles of physics, mortality kinetics, disease kinetics in humans, there really does seem to be this barrier. And whether it's 115 or 130, people can debate exactly where it falls, but it does seem to be something fundamentally different. And I think the dissatisfying thing is I can't describe it in any more precise terms than that.
Sure.
Other than it just seems to be different than what we've been studying so far.
Right. So interesting. And it's great for all the viewers and listeners that Dr. Kaeberlein made a key point that we've been working on health span. We haven't been working on the biology to extend the number. It's how well we live up until then. That deals with aging and everything associated with it.
Yeah. Although let me clarify. I mean, I think we have been working on the biology that extends the number. It just turns out that what we found is that biology only gets us so far.
Yeah.
And again, this is the way fields evolve sometimes because the field matured to the point where people got so focused on the mechanisms that were allowing us to get up to this point, we stopped looking for the other stuff, right? This is something that I've been trying to point out for a while now, that we really need to go back to this sort of discovery science, stop pretending like we understand the biology of aging completely and let the biology tell us what we don't understand. And I think there are powerful ways we can do that now. And I'd like to see more resources be allocated to that sort of discovery science going forward.
The great part is you not only, I guess, study it, teach it, but you live it. I mean, you're in great shape, continue to push yourself. If you could slow down one part of aging, knowing what you know, what would it be?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I guess the way I would say this is, I think it's a very individual thing, right?
Sure.
So I'm fortunate where at least, well, my wife might disagree, but I was gonna say at least so far I haven't experienced much cognitive decline, but I think that's the one most people are really worried about, right? And I totally get it.
Right.
Like I think maybe a different way to say it is, if there's one thing I wouldn't want to have decline early, I think it would be cognitive decline. Obviously, that's super, super important. But having said that, I think, I'm somebody, and a lot of people are, who likes to be able to go out physically and do the stuff that I want to do. And so, I've spent quite a bit of my own effort on maintaining my physical function so that I can go out and do the daily activities that I think are fun, right? And spend time and do fun stuff with my kids and my family and my friends. So I don't think there's one thing I can point to that I would say I would prioritize over the others. The great thing is, again, within your own genetic constraints, when you try to optimize your health span through lifestyle modifications, maybe even some biohacking, if you're successful, you're going to slow all of the functional declines that go along with aging. And again, I think that's the real message here is by prioritizing your health span, right, through the biology of aging, you maintain your health span, as opposed to, I think, certainly from the medical perspective, we have typically looked at individual diseases in isolation and tried to cure those diseases once people get sick or minimize risk for individual diseases. It's much better, in my view, to focus on what's going to improve your overall health, what's going to give you the best aging trajectory you possibly can.
Love that. And you kind of mentioned, I was going to say, what's for people watching or listening, what's the biggest thing that you would recommend? But I think you talked about lifestyle modifications and exercise and things like that. For people who are interested in following your work, and keeping updated with the latest and greatest, where would you steer them?
So we've got a podcast. It's called the OptiSpan Podcast. It's on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, all that stuff. I'm semi-active. I'm trying to get better on socials, at mKaeberlein on X, Instagram. I'm also on LinkedIn. People can find me there if they want to.
It's been a pleasure listening.
Yeah.
I haven't said a whole lot. I've just been listening in, and I think that
we're absorbing.
You, I think the knowledge that you have from not only just running, SAGEs, because everything is based on using literature and science-based and evidence-based medicine, which this field right now is lacking, especially with some of the biohackers and people that are doing things that are just off the cuff. I think we are very lucky to have someone like you that is doing this and is also integrating it into the OptiSpan using, preventative medicine and hopefully putting all that data together, because a lot of, like you said, a lot of it is just a business that's being run. So they don't really care as much. And something John and I really care about with doing regenerative medicine, we're trying to get some good data so we can show that it's effective. It's easy to just anecdotally tell you you're going to feel good, but being able to have some markers, whether it's through lab data or through diagnostics, and being able to partner up with, a monster like yourself in a good way. You were running the show and you really can put together the data really well. So I look forward to hopefully working with you. We look forward to hopefully working with you and implementing some of this stuff together, whether it's showing how therapeutic plasma exchange really helps. Because again, there's some data, but not a lot. So if we take multiple clinics that are doing the same type of thing and have the same outlook on preventing disease and treating with regenerative medicine or using therapeutic things like therapeutic plasma exchange and showing how it's beneficial instead of just saying, trust me, it's going to work, I think it'll really help in the long run. So thank you very much for having me.
To work for, right? I mean, I think that's the piece, is this idea that there are one size fits all solutions. I mean, I think around lifestyle, there are some general things that are more or less one size fits all, but that rapidly gets to the point where you have to personalize it. And I think with these interventions, again, this gray area that I talked about, I have no doubt that there are things in there that work really, really well for some people, but we really need to be able to understand, who is this going to work for? Who might it not work for? I think the other thing that's worth maybe just mentioning is, especially when we're talking about longevity, right? So we're talking about, outcomes that, if all goes to plan, are going to have impacts for multiple decades, right? So there we really also need to understand, what does the risk reward look like? I think the risk piece sometimes gets dropped when we're talking about 3 decades down the road. And this is, I think, just, again, worth explicitly stating. Maybe a caloric restriction is a good example where, I believe, so caloric restriction is the gold standard for slowing aging in laboratory animals. It works, and it always works. There are certain genotypes where it doesn't work, which is important. If in people, that might mean there are certain people where caloric restriction is actually going to be harmful. But by and large, if you had to ask me, I can't prove it, but if you forced me to give an answer, I would say, yeah, I think caloric restriction down to at least a certain level slows aging in people. And there's evidence to support that. And I think there are negative consequences to caloric restriction in people over decades, which are going to more than offset the benefits from aging more slowly. That piece, I think, is important to appreciate when we're talking about outcomes that are 2, 3, 4 decades long. We want to be careful that even if we're successful at moving the biomarkers for aging in the right direction, we aren't going to do something that's going to counteract those benefits in the long run. And that's a harder thing to answer, right? Again, there's going to be some guesswork involved, but it is important to at least recognize that we want to be aware of that.
More amazing videos just like this one. Watch.
This is a risk that is modifiable via lifestyle. So you're better off finding out about it than just being blind, because you could have avoided the outcome if you knew ahead of time.